Kamala Harris's lead over Donald Trump has shrunk to just 1 percentage point, according to the latest Reuters Ipsos survey of the nation, which pushed the race at 44 to 43. Harris's lead in national polling averages has narrowed over the last 2 months. According to Decision Desk HQ, Harris now has a 46% chance of winning the race. That's down from a 56% chance DDHQ gave her in September. Joining us to discuss the state of the presidential race and much more, Jesse Byrnes, senior editor here at The Hill. Hey, Jesse. 46, 56, it's essentially a coin flip. I don't know really what that is supposed to mean for us at this point, and some of these national polls are obviously not all that relevant because the race will be decided in the Electoral College. But one thing that I do think is interesting is that it appears we're shaping up for a closer election in the popular vote. If you look back at recent elections, Democrats, Hillary in 2016 won by 3 million votes. Joe Biden in 2020 won by 7 million votes. Do you think we're possibly in store for a tighter national race?
I think we are. I think it's a little bit complicated. There's some caveats here, right? In 2020, it was record turnout, but it was also COVID, and a lot of more people were voting early. They were voting by mail. Right now, it looks like we're not quite tracking with the number of people who are voting early than in 2020, but it's also not COVID. People have the luxury of waiting up until Election Day to actually go to the polls, and we are seeing more Republicans actually register to vote in a lot of these states than in prior elections, and so it at least has raised the specter that that Trump could actually win the popular vote, which is a disaster for Democrats because Hillary Clinton won it by 3 million, Biden won it by 7 million. Democrats have long been favored going back years. And so if it is trending that direction and Trump is actually even close to winning the popular vote, that spells disaster for Harris's campaign when it comes to the actual Electoral College, which really makes the difference.
What about this notion that he's doing better in states that don't really matter? New York, Texas, California, Florida. And he runs up the numbers there, but Harris still protects the blue wall states. And this scenario that's one thought to be completely out of the realm, now maybe some possibility that Trump wins the popular vote and Harris wins the Electoral College?
Yeah, certainly for bragging rights, if he runs up the vote in places like New York or even in the Deep South, if he runs up the vote and wins by a large margin, he could have bragging rights, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. Popular vote or the Electoral College is what actually determines who's going to win. And so those 7 battleground states are going to determine who wins on election night. And so beyond that, it's more of a vanity contest who actually wins the popular vote.
I wanted to ask you about Nikki Haley. In a recent interview, she said that she hasn't spoken to Donald Trump since June. That seems like political malfeasance on the part of the Trump campaign. Harris is going after Nikki Haley's voters. Haley says she's ready to counter that. Why is the Trump campaign not using her to speak to moderate Republicans?
Look, it's a huge misstep if that is actually true, and we anticipate that the Trump campaign, others have spoken to Haley's folks, but not the candidate himself. And Nikki Haley was, of course, hugely popular on the campaign trail among Republicans. She doesn't, obviously lost to Trump by quite a bit of margin, but she still was polling 10, 20% in places even after she got out of the race. And so that shows that there is a slice of the electorate on the Republican side that don't like Donald Trump, but are still inclined to vote for the Republican ticket. And so to have that lack of courting those voters and courting Haley herself, now we have her out there publicly on camera criticizing the campaign, criticizing the Madison Square Garden rally appearance instead of being at campaign rallies advocating for Trump. That's a huge deciding factor.
I wonder if that changes here in the last few days of the campaign. I wanted to ask you a little bit, you touched on early voting. More than 55 million people have already cast ballots according to the University of Florida Election Lab. I've heard analysis that this is bad so far the numbers are bad for Democrats. I've heard analysis that it's bad for Republicans. I've heard analysis that you can't compare this to previous elections, so you should just throw everything we've seen out so far. What have you seen that you find interesting or important in the early voting numbers?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting the fact that you have Republicans who are just generally actually voting early. This is a huge change from the last 2 elections where Trump was casting doubt on voting early, was trying to gin up enthusiasm for Republicans to vote on election day only, and that is still largely when most Republicans are going to vote. They're going to wait until the very end and vote on election day. But I think the fact that more Republicans are actually following Trump's lead on this and voting early, I think is largely probably going to help Republicans. And remains to be seen how much it helps them. But the fact that they're actually doing votes over multiple weeks instead of just one day is certainly going to help their turnout.
What about the gender gap that we're seeing in states that do actually report that? It's not all, but in the states that do report, we're seeing women plus 10 in early voting. That seems like it would probably be a good sign for Democrats.
Yeah, certainly, Harris has made this campaign a referendum on Trump on the issue of abortion, democracy, on the issue of abortion. In places like even Texas, the deep red state, she has campaigned there and tried to link Trump to efforts to curtail abortion rights in Texas. Obviously, we have a ballot measure in Florida this year, places that Trump is still going to win. But having women turn out in these critical areas, abortion is a huge spot. So if more women are actually turning out to the polls, that's a big win for Harris. If more men are turning out in battlegrounds, that's a big win for Trump.
I want to ask you about this ruling we got from the U.S. Supreme Court. They denied an effort by RFK Jr. to have his name removed from ballots in Michigan and Wisconsin. He's a former independent candidate. He dropped out and has since endorsed Donald Trump. In these states where we expect it to be razor close, could his name being on the ballot have an impact?
Yeah, absolutely. You look back in 2016, Jill Stein had an impact in Wisconsin. In 2020, Biden defeated Trump by just 150,000 votes out of more than 5 million in Michigan. And so even though, RFK has been very clear, he supports Trump, they've appeared at rallies together, if even a quarter or half a percentage voters, point voters, support RFK instead of actually supporting Trump, that can make a real difference in places like Michigan or Wisconsin, which could come down to a coin flip.
And Stein on those ballots in those states as well, so potentially drawing from the Harris campaign. Another ruling from the Supreme Court is going to allow the state of Virginia to continue a purge of its voter rolls. This is a victory for the Republican governor in Virginia, Glenn Youngkin, who says this purge is necessary to keep non-citizens from voting. Democrats and voter rights groups have said it could potentially prevent legal voters from voting. There's also a federal judge that dismissed a Republican lawsuit that looked to throw out thousands of overseas ballots. Has the lawfare begun in this election, and do you expect to see this kind of waged over the next week and even after?
Yeah, there's certainly going to be a lot of illegal efforts on the part of Republicans in particular trying to throw out certain ballots that they can. But largely, I think you're going to see courts push back on that, all the way up to the Supreme Court. They do not want to do anything in these final closing days of the election that could potentially alter the outcome. And so, Virginia, we're talking about 1,600 votes out of millions that are being cast. And so it's a minute number. But even there, I think that you're going to see a lot of courts trying to push back on kind of any efforts to alter the ballots because there is so much scrutiny heading into this election after two prior elections when Trump claimed for years that the election was stolen.
I want to talk about the battle for control of the U.S. House. This is going to be pivotal to whichever candidate wins the presidency. The GOP right now has this narrow 8-member advantage, Democrats trying to retake control, but it's complicated by some key Democrats that are retiring or have moved on. I want to just name a couple of them. Abigail Spanberger in Virginia is running for governor in 2025. Dan Kildee, a longtime representative from Michigan, is retiring. Alyssa Slotkin is running for Senate right now in Michigan. And Katie Porter, who has been an influential lawmaker from California, tried to run for Senate and lost in the Democratic primary. How difficult do you think it will be for Democrats to retake the House, considering they have all these members that are not going to be on the ballot?
Well, they certainly have a much better chance than they're going to take back the Senate, right? And so Decision Desk is giving it, I think it's a 53% chance, very similar to the White House race right now for Trump in terms of the Republican advantage. So it's very tight, it's very close. It's going to come down to these handful of states. Watch Slotkin's district. I think that's going to be very key. In Michigan, there's a potential for Republicans to have a couple pickup opportunities there. And Republicans overall, it's going to be tight margin, right? We're not going to have a 20, 30 seat advantage for either party. And so it's going to be a slim margin for either side. Same with the Senate. We're going to come down to maybe 1-2 seat upper hand for either party, or for Republicans rather. And so that is, we're going to have divided government more than likely in January. But whichever party is in control, even though they're going to have chairmanships, they're going to have the ability to flex their power on Capitol Hill, they're still going to have to work across the aisle to get anything done. And so I think you're going to see a lot more, at least a push for bipartisanship early on because there's going to be such slim margins.
Yeah, and you mentioned, I think all those races will be key indicators on election night to give us an indication of where it's going to go across the nation. Jesse Byrnes, senior editor here at The Hill. Appreciate you coming on, sharing your views.
Thanks, Drew.
Nearly 100 people in Gaza's Beit Lahia region have been killed after an Israeli airstrike targeted residential buildings. The city is now being classified as a disaster area by local authorities. Officials are reporting mass devastation in the area, with shelters, schools, hospitals, and houses destroyed. Videos circulating online show ambulances not being allowed into the area to access the wounded. Civilians in the city had reportedly opened their homes to civilians fleeing from Jabalia, an area where the Israeli military had been focusing operations 3 weeks ago. The U.S. is now demanding answers from Israel about the airstrikes, which State Department spokesman Matt Miller called horrifying. An Israeli military source told CNN the buildings may have been a Hamas gathering point. Airstrikes also rocketed Lebanon's city of Baalbek after Israel issued an evacuation order for the area. Officials say the city is now empty after residents fled from their homes. At least 43,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza since October 7, 2023, when Hamas militants attacked Israel, killing over 1,200 civilians and taking scores of hostages, dozens of whom are still being held in Gaza. At least 72 people are dead following flash floods in eastern Spain. The floods have been described as some of the worst to hit Spain in over 30 years. The storms have swept away cars, submerged villages, and hindered rail lines and highways. The storm started on Tuesday and continued on into Wednesday. The flooding spans a wide area from southern to eastern Spain. Countless are still missing as searchers are working to locate victims and survivors. The Spanish government has said it plans to declare 3 days of mourning for the dead following the floods. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hill's YouTube channel, and come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.